Well, we're 12:01. I think we can get started, and people will filter in as they please. But I'm very happy to be talking with Owen Gaffney today with the Exponential Roadmap. Hello, Owen.
Hi.
So a little bit about Owen. He is the co-founder of the Exponential Roadmap Initiative, Global Sustainability Analyst at Stockholm Resilience Center and the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. I'm going to keep going. Faculty member at Singularity University, editor at large at Global Commons Alliance, and Edmund Hillary Fellow. So quite a mouthful there. You must stay quite busy. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about various roles and a little bit about your background before we get into the topics.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Andy. And it's fantastic to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation to talk about the Exponential Roadmap. As you say, I'm a global sustainability analyst. I work on ideas like the Anthropocene and planetary boundaries, and work at the interface between policy and business and the media and science. So how these ideas come from science and move out to the broader world. So I do a lot of thinking on that and action on that. And I suppose the Exponential Roadmap is one big part of that. My background is I'm an engineer, an astronautic engineer by training, sort of satellite and spacecraft design. But I've been working for many years in media and communications before, about 15 years ago, starting to move into Earth system science and these kinds of things. And so that's kind of how I've evolved into this role I have now.
Okay. Now that you brought up Earth system science, actually, that's something that I'm really interested in. Could you just say a few words about what that is? Because it might be new to some of the viewers.
Yeah, I guess so. Earth system science is a new scientific domain that's evolved over the last 3 decades or so. That takes a systems view of of Earth. How are the ice sheets and the oceans and land and the atmosphere connected? How do the cycles, the nitrogen cycle, the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the phosphorus cycle, how are these connected? And how do we and what keeps the planet stable? How do we stay in this sort of stable regime we've been in the last 10,000 years? What's happened in the past to take us out of those stable regimes, and what could happen in the future that takes us out of those stable regimes? So it's like a systems view of the planet.
Yeah, and tipping points are pretty important for that, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So tipping points research has really come a long way. In the first big sort of systems view of tipping points, identifying what are the big tipping points in the Earth system, was first published in 2008, really identifying 15 tipping points in the Earth system. So the West Antarctic ice sheet, the East Antarctic ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest, Arctic sea ice, the North Atlantic overturning circulation, coral reefs. They could all reach a temperature threshold where they change irrecoverably, irreversibly, and that'll have a big impact on us. Permafrost in the northern hemisphere, for example, if that starts melting, that starts pumping more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, making it more difficult to solve the climate challenge. So back in 2008, Tim Lenton at Exeter University and a bunch of researchers identified about 15. Then Tim, myself, and some colleagues published a paper last year identifying that actually 9 of those tipping points are now active. We can actually, we thought 10, 15 years ago that there were potential for tipping, but that wouldn't happen for much later in this century or the following centuries when temperatures reach 3 or 4 degrees above pre-industrial. But in fact, we're actually seeing some major changes right now in 9 of those tipping points. The West Antarctic ice sheet, the Amazon rainforest, it's becoming less of a carbon store as the years go by, and it could actually tip from storing carbon to actually emitting carbon as early as 2030, 2035. So these are active, and this is really, really concerning.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess that's good why we are trying to popularize the science that you're so familiar with, and why your work is so important. I guess I'll get into some of your the work that you're doing now at Exponential Roadmap. Something that we talked about before this was that you were interested in exponential and disruptive approaches to scaling solutions. So that's going from the science to some sort of solutions. What do you mean by the exponential and disruptive approaches?
Yeah, so good question. Well, 10, 15 years ago, when we were talking about the climate challenge, and we look at all these spaghetti graphs of going into the future of emissions trajectories and, where the world is going to go. And pretty much they're all showing a fairly incremental decrease of greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, the energy transition would be quite gradual. We could still imagine some greenhouse gases, some fossil fuel companies still operating well into this century, way beyond 2050. And over the last 10, 15 years, we've realized, two things really. That first is that we must change our trajectory much faster. I mean, we need to get out the risks of remaining in this incremental pathway are too serious to stay on. We must actually ramp up pace to do that. And secondly, that in fact, despite all these incremental predictions, we're on a much faster trajectory for the energy transition and for transport transition too. That it can be done much faster and be economically stable than previously thought. So those two things are combining, and this is where we start getting into the roadmap of how do we shift our worldviews from incremental to exponential thinking. And I should just say then one thing about exponential thinking. What are exponentials? And it's quite clear, from the global pandemic that one of the biggest failings of humanity is our inability to understand the exponential function. That even as the pandemic was raging through China and through parts of Asia, and you saw countries like South Korea and Hong Kong taking very draconian action because they've seen what happens when SARS hit, a decade ago. Countries in Europe were very, very slow to take off, and countries in America were the rhetoric from policymakers was that, well, we've only got 10 cases in our country. I mean, it's not really affecting us in the same way it is affecting those others. But 10 became 20, became 40, became 80. And we're on that exponential trajectory where within a week or two you have hundreds of thousands of cases. And people are surprised by this. So there is this kind of our society doesn't really understand nonlinear change, doesn't understand tipping points, doesn't understand the power of exponentials, both positive and negative. And the exponential roadmap is about, I guess, shifting that worldview.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so exponential roadmap, that's what you've been working on. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's in there? What are you suggesting should happen if we're going to have this exponential thinking?
Okay, so this all came about in 2017. We published a paper in the journal Science called the carbon law trajectory on emissions reductions, and we proposed. I think we were the first to propose that to stabilize the climate at a reasonable level, we needed to halve emissions by 2030, halve them again by 2040, halve them again by 2050. So we call that the carbon law, and that really came from a conversation, two conversations. First conversation I had with Johan Rockström, the director of the Potsdam Institute, when we were leaving Paris after the Paris Agreement in 2015, and we were saying, do people really understand the scale of change that the economy will need to make to stabilize at well below 2 degrees? People were really talking about net zero sometime after 2050. But in reality, that means a massive shift before 2030 to make that a reality. So the carbon law trajectory came out of that. And another conversation with Johan Falk, a former executive at Intel, who's now co-lead with me on the Exponential Roadmap, who was saying, the exponential thinking, the exponential approach is actually a very powerful approach as a business philosophy, as an economic philosophy for driving change. Just staying on that, the Moore's law trajectory in the tech sector of doubling computer power every 2 years and halving the price every 2 years. That simple law keeps hundreds of thousands of companies in the tech sector on this exponential trajectory. To now we're at a point where we've got 30 billion transistors on a chip that could rest on your thumb. We were at a couple of hundred back when Moore's law was suggested in the 1960s. So that's the sort of background to the framing. So we published a scientific paper on that, and then we published the first roadmap that sort of outlines for policymakers and the business community with the solutions to get to that first halving. And what's remarkable is that it is possible to halve emissions by 2030 with existing technologies. We don't need any new technologies. What we need to do is to scale the solutions, 36 solutions that are already on the table.
Wow, really interesting. That you bring up something that came up in the panel discussion as well about popularizing a new narrative. And like you said, when it comes to technology, Moore's law has been a very powerful narrative that's been driving the industry. And so I think it's really interesting that you're bringing that same sort of narrative into the would and that there's actually solutions that we can do it. It's not just a story; it's actually something we can start doing. So, what would some of the ideas? What are the scalable solutions that you have in the Exponential Roadmap then?
Yeah, okay. So, and just before, maybe I'll just respond on that particular point, that what is very powerful about the exponential narrative is that, it turns a distant sort of quite abstract target of, well below 2 degrees, from the Paris Agreement into something that, myself or you, Andy, could apply in our own lives of halving emissions, or a business, or a city, or a nation. So it applies. It's like a fractal. It can apply at all these different scales, and that's quite important. I mean, that's a learning from Moore's law. This doubling is, well, if you're Intel or Microsoft, etc., you as a company can actually follow that law, even though it's a sort of general rule of thumb. So the kind of solutions, so we can break the solutions down into several baskets, the energy sector, industrial sector, transport, food systems, and buildings. And so those 36 solutions are broken down into those five big sectors. And so, and obviously, everybody on this call will be familiar with this energy solutions. It's photovoltaics, it's wind, it's the renewable systems. I guess when we get into, but one key, but with the food systems, for example, then we have food waste and moving to lower meat diets and vegetarian diets, for example. These could bring very big gains. So it's a win-win in many different ways. It's something that could be driven very rapidly in society through strong policy, strong educational policies, and strong educational marketing initiatives, etc. So it doesn't necessarily require new technology, but then could be accelerated with new technology. So we have mobility, mass mobility, mass transits, for example. we can't just rely on electric vehicles. We should be investing in an integrated transport system. 70% of transport emissions are from cities, so that's a big and it's reasonably easy to reduce transport emissions in cities by creating the right transport infrastructure to incentivize low emissions travel, which will also improve people's health, reduce pollution, and bring multiple benefits. And we could see potentially with the pandemic, which is an event. Obviously that event wasn't included in the roadmap, but it's almost an accelerator for a lot of the solutions we provided. We could potentially accelerate progress 3 or 4 years because of the progress in certain areas on transport, on air pollution, on using these technologies to avoid events and having digital events instead. So we've accelerated things potentially 3 or 4 years if we can build on this momentum now.
Okay, great. I'm curious if you could talk to why the different sectors were chosen in the Exponential Roadmap. So you talked about energy, and I think you brought up transport and foods. Were there certain reasons why those were picked?
Yeah, I guess these are a fairly standard way of breaking down the various sectors for emissions. I mean, a lot of the big economic and policy models follow that kind of sectoral breakdown. So, I mean, first off, we have the data broken down in that way. So that, and you can break down, the actual sort of physical solutions break down neatly by that. But of course, then you have these cross-cutting solutions to drive the change too. We need the sort of financial mechanisms, the policy mechanisms, and the social movements as well to bring about the changes in worldviews and accelerate the change that way. So we see those as the key accelerators, and the sort of sectors as the solutions.
Okay. Well, now that you brought up some of the financial sector topics, what if you're working in the financial sector, if you're working for a city or you're a politician, what are some either by looking into the Exponential Roadmap or elsewise?
Well, I mean, cities have phenomenal financial influence. There's so much investment, so much infrastructure investment is driven by cities and city authorities, and they could insist on green procurement of absolutely everything across the board. I mean, I think that would be one of the key financial tools they could use. I mean, more generally, one of the biggest issues we're having at the moment is there's still so much subsidies handed over to the fossil fuel industry, but also subsidies to agriculture and that promote a certain type of agriculture. And these subsidies, the IMF has calculated that subsidies for fossil fuels amount to about $5 trillion when you look at the sort of negative effects as well, sort of health effects and pollution, etc. So 5 trillion, that's a large percentage of global GDP is going on fossil fuels. So if we're removing those subsidies and changing agricultural subsidies would be a very, very big incentive for a rapid shift. And then, of course, there's a price on carbon. That is, it's not a panacea, but it does certainly change trajectories. It's a very, very simple tool for doing that. And here in Sweden, we have a price on carbon of over $100 a ton now. That's been in place for a decade or so. Now we have a very, very low price on oil. A ridiculously crazy low price on oil would be a very, very good time to add a price on carbon. It would almost be not noticeable. And then as prices increase again, that would send a good, strong signal to markets to start changing. So there, I mean, some of the financial packages, that need to come together very rapidly to change direction.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I want to keep going on about this, but I'm going to move on a little bit here. We talked about we talked about technology quite a bit here, and I'm wondering what would you say to people working in the technology sector? What is your work kind of? How does it address technology? Do you have anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, I think technology is really one of the wild cards in the transition. In the next decade, we're going to have, basically, people in my world in climate research and global sustainability, we talk about we need an economic transformation as soon as possible. But that economic transformation is coming. Technology is absolutely driving it, and we know that artificial intelligence, robotics, the Internet of Things, biotechnology is going to change the world of work. It's going to change health systems. It's going to change economic systems over the next few decades. So how do we lock in a shift towards sustainability? Because at the moment, it's not clear whether this economic transformation from technology that is coming, whether it will increase emissions or work to reduce emissions. So this is one of the key parts of the roadmap, is to look at how technology can actually work to reduce emissions. And we see, some of the leverage points are the key, technology platforms. People, places like Google and Facebook, Amazon, Apple, these are the first $1 trillion companies, or heading that way. So they hold phenomenal influence, and they are very good at talking about their own emissions. They have very enlightened leadership, largely. Jeff Bezos is being forced to be enlightened by his staff. But the others have, got very smart people, very enlightened leaders who talk a lot about sustainability and their own emissions. And Apple talks about becoming a 100% circular as soon as possible, and we've been part of the discussion with Apple on that. And Google's talking about becoming zero emissions, and Facebook, but they don't talk about their consumers, that they are influencing the decisions of the 3 to 4 billion people in the world, the world's middle classes, who are the biggest consumers, the biggest emitters. And we think that we need to start having a conversation where those platforms talk about supporting societal goals. How can they actually support societal goals rather than undermining democracy? How can they support democracy rather than driving up emissions? How can they support everybody's desire for a stable planet? They all have these, you look at their mission statements and vision statements. They're all talking about being, the global leader, changing the world's information, connecting the world, becoming the world's, biggest supplier, Well, those visions and mission statements need to start including a stable planet, actually supporting that as a goal, and virtually none of them do at the moment. I think, apart from potentially Alibaba.
Yeah, that touches on something that came up earlier in the environmental commitments from the universities. Nico, he said that science we can't be doing science with the old way of thinking, where it just needs to be neutral. And this is the same thing with technology companies. You can't just be neutral about your users. You might want to change your emissions as a company, but you have some responsibility to the influence you have on the people using your platform. So I think that was a really great point.
Yeah, well, actually, if I just to respond on that, I mean, they are absolutely not neutral. They are actively promoting their advertising algorithms. They, to the highest bidder, they give the prominent locations regardless of the emissions of that highest bidder. So that's to me, that's in no way neutral. That is a deliberate policy for driving up emissions.
Yeah, good point. Okay, so we're talking about companies now, specifically tech companies, but generally for companies, what's some of the recommendations you have I know you have the 1.5 degrees Celsius Business Playbook. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about what's in there and what companies can do.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So, that's so following the Exponential Roadmap, our next extremely exciting product is the 1.5 Business Playbook. And what we wanted to do was to create a super easy to follow and adopt playbook for CEOs for companies to sign up to 1.5. And so we've created this playbook. We launched it at World Economic Forum earlier this year with Christiane Figueres and with Johan Rockström, and we've had a brilliant take up for it. We're now working with the International Chamber of Commerce and UNFCCC. There's going to be there was due to have a climate summit later this year. That's now going to happen in 2021. But so we're working with UNFCCC and International Chamber of Commerce to launch the playbook for millions of small and medium-sized enterprises. The problem we've identified is that if you want to sign up to science-based targets for climate, it actually takes a huge effort for a company to do that. It can be a huge process lasting a year or more to have your targets accepted and to put all the infrastructure in place to do that. And even then, we'd question whether the targets are ambitious enough. So we want to set up a process for CEOs to go, all right, I can see very clearly, just need to follow these 4 steps, and then I will be adopting a carbon law trajectory for stabilizing Earth at 1.5 degrees. And that's basically what we've put together with the playbook to do just that.
Is there some kind of commitment that goes with that, or are you just kind of you go along, or is there a platform for help along with the playbook?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're working with the International Chamber of Commerce to create that platform for to help with it. To create that process for businesses to sign up. And it's based on 4 pillars. The first pillar, reduce your own emissions. The second pillar, reduce your value chain emissions. Third pillar, integrate climate into your business strategy. And fourth pillar is influence your consumers who are using your products and society more generally, all along that carbon law framing, halving emissions by 2030 or sooner. A lot of companies can do it much faster, and it's good for their balance sheets, because one of the most interesting findings, I guess, during this pandemic, what companies have been able to weather this the best, it's the companies who have strong ESG at their foundation, sort of environmental, social, and good governance. Those companies that have that as their foundation are the companies that are weathering the storm. So we believe actually following the business playbook is going to be a positive route out of this situation we're in right now.
Okay, great. And so if they wanted to learn about what we've been talking about here, where would you recommend them to go?
Yeah, okay, so we've got the Exponential Roadmap website, so exponentialroadmap.org. Also, we'll have an announcement today for World Environment Day on this initiative with the International Chamber of Commerce. So there'll be material there, and the International Chamber of Commerce is representing millions of companies. So that's our goal over the next 6 months to 12 months, is to develop that strategy to scale literally to millions of companies, and to learn as we're doing, but to put the investment into to making that happen.
Very exciting. Well, I guess we'll have to end it there. I can tell I could keep talking to you for a long time, but we'll have to save it for the next time. But I wanted to thank you, Owen. I really appreciate it, and I will post here in the comments where you can find Exponential Roadmap. And thank you again.
Thank you, Andy. It's been a pleasure to take part.
All right. Bye now.
Cheers.